in her most recent work of fiction called 8 Girls Taking Pictures. One of my favorite authors, Whitney Otto, examines the world's many injustices through the lens of a camera. The book takes place in the early 1900s, and her female characters focus primarily on gender inequality, but they manage to capture many of life's inequities by simply wandering through the world while holding their cameras as though they were an appendage to their bodies. One character, flushed with the new experience and excitement of photography, claims that photography is like painting with light. She winds up in New York City for an unexpected 5-day excursion, and this is what happens. This is how Whitney Otto describes the experience. She had been to New York, walking herself to exhaustion, and all its beauty could not blind her to the immigrant slums she saw, overcrowded darkness of some parts of the city. The overcrowded darkness of some parts of the city. It was her habit as a photographer to constantly observe the light, natural or artificial. The poor in these neighborhoods were so crammed together that one of the luxuries they were forced to forego was sunlight. Strange to think that money bought the sun, which rightfully belonged to no one. She was slightly amazed that the wealthy would find ways to keep and control something that shouldn't have been anyone's to control. Maybe it was because she had grown up from a poor girl into a young woman who had to watch every penny that things like this often crossed her mind. Well, this brief snapshot of New York took me back to when I first rented my first apartment right on the edge of Spanish Harlem. I thought it rather striking then that everyone in the neighborhood was outside, either wandering the sidewalks or sitting on the front stoops. What a lively place this is, I remember thinking, failing to realize that we were all outside because our tenement apartments were so dark. I had a light shaft, perhaps 3 feet square, that provided the only light in my apartment for 3 rooms. I could literally shake hands with a tenant in the apartment across the light shaft from me. It never occurred to me that in the affluent neighborhood of the Upper East Side, which was just to the south, the apartments and condos were flooded with sunlight pouring through large picture windows. I didn't understand why the streets felt so dead, hardly populated. Everyone must have been inside. It's truly strange to think that money can buy the sun, and slightly amazing that the wealthy could find ways to keep and control something that shouldn't have been anyone's to control. It was Kenneth Clark who in 1954 argued on behalf of school integration in the famous case before the U.S. Supreme Court known as Brown versus the Board of Education. Clark critiqued even the possibility of academic objectivity by asking the arresting question, how is it possible to study a slum objectively? In other words, experiencing injustice cannot be impartially evaluated by those who don't even realize that they control things that should lie beyond anyone's control. As a child, because of the decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, I was bused from a black neighborhood school to a white neighborhood school that existed just across the tracks in the borough of Queens. Words fail in describing the difference between those two schools. Let me simply say that they were separate and unequal. I awoke for the first time to one of the great inequities in our society. The 19th century Unitarian senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, employed the metaphor of a dinner table. He said, "There are dinners without appetites on one end of the table, and appetites without dinners at the other end. Some people have too much and don't know what to do with it. Some people have too little and don't know how to get enough." The second UU principle takes the bold step of promoting justice, equity, and compassion in a society that prides itself on individualism, which means that it's all about getting as much as one can for oneself without regards for another. I think it takes a lot of audacity to even propose this principle, to invite this principle to influence our faith, and to profess that this principle must impact our behavior as we witness the unevenness of life so transparently obvious before us. In a recent report coming out of UC Berkeley evaluating how family incomes have changed between 2009 and 2011, the first 2 years of the recovery, we learned that incomes grew among the top 1% of the population by more than 11% on average. As for the other 99%, incomes shrank. The gap between rich and poor has been growing since the 1970s and reached a 90-year peak in the year 2007, just before the financial crisis. And we're well back on the road of widening economic disparity. Our current Utah legislative session, which has mercifully concluded this week, how much punishment can we take? This legislative session saw Republicans kill a bill that would have expanded preschool for at-risk Utah children. I don't know if these children will ever be able to leave the darkness of their environment. It would have cost but $10 million for a chance for them to move someday into the light of the sun. Equally incomprehensible is our current Utah legislature killing a bill that would have banned housing and employment discrimination based on sex orientation and gender identity. The bill was viewed as controversial. Imagine framing a basic human right that prohibits discrimination, labeling that as controversial. I am as stunned as was another character in the Whitney Otto book, who, in contemplating the suffragette movement and the women who were beaten in prison because of the hunger strike that they were doing, the character was of the opinion that you should be allowed to be who you are. It's that simple. You should be allowed to be who you are. And the inequities in society are as obvious as the graphic image of the dining table, where some have more than an abundance while others have nothing at all. This is why I believe that the second UU principle is the most difficult to pursue, to affirm and promote justice, equity, compassion in human relations. You know, it doesn't say, wouldn't it be nice, or wouldn't it be lovely if somehow we could feel justice, equity, and compassion in human relations? Quite the contrary. The burden is on us as religious people to make it happen. For Unitarians today and historically, the spiritual life must always express itself ethically. An old, treasured Unitarian historian from the past, Earl Morse Wilbur, traced this idea of the spiritual as ethical back to the liberal church movement in 16th century Poland. Influenced by this new phenomenon of Unitarianism, which spread through Transylvania by the Unitarian King John, well, it really spread beyond the borders somewhat, and Faustus Socinus led a movement of 3,000 Polish liberals, and his followers were called, after his name, Faustus Socinus, they were called Socinians. They established a completely new theology. Jesus saved, Socinus argued, not by his death on the cross, but by the persuasive powers of his life on earth. The Socinian church emphasized covenants, not only among people within the community, but to include responsibilities to those outside the community. So their religion, or their spiritual interests, were served only through the application of their ethical beliefs to daily life. Members of those congregations evaluated each other about meeting those responsibilities. And these were not perfunctory evaluations, but very sobering occasions when they met on 4 Saturdays during the year to confess their sins, and failing to live up to the expected social accountability of their daily habits. Although these congregations eventually died out, some claim because the moral demands were too strict. They represent the antecedents to Unitarianism's commitment to building a just world.